When I was a kid, my grandfather told me stories about a strange man in the woods. I wish I believed them. When I was a kid, my grandfather used to tell me strange stories about the forest behind his house in West Virginia. He called it the Hollow, a shadowy stretch of land that seemed to swallow sound. Even in the brightest daylight, it felt unnaturally dim, the canopy above weaving an oppressive quilt of leaves and branches. Grandpa would sit in his creaky rocking chair, pipe smoke curling around his head, and tell me tales about the strange things he'd seen. Most of them were harmless, glowing lights flitting between the trees or distant laughter with no source. But there was one story he refused to talk about until he was drunk on moonshine. It was the story of the lantern maker. Back in the early 1900s, there was a man who lived alone deep in the hollow. People rarely saw him, but when they did, he was always carrying an old iron lantern. He'd walk the forest at night, the flickering light barely illuminating his gaunt face and wild eyes. Some said he was a hermit, others whispered he was a sorcerer. But everyone agreed he was dangerous. Local legends claimed he could weave strange things into existence with his lantern. It wasn't just light it cast, it was shadows, thick and alive. People swore they'd seen impossible shapes moving in the forest, things that were too large, too fast, and too quiet to be animals. One night, a group of drunken townsfolk decided to put an end to the lantern maker's witchcraft. They armed themselves with pitchforks, shotguns, and torches and marched into the hollow. Grandpa said they never came back, not as men, anyway. A week later, strange figures started appearing near the edges of the forest. They looked like men, but they weren't. Their limbs were too long, their eyes too wide, and their skin was a sickly, pale gray. The townsfolk called them the lantern maker's creations, twisted things born from shadows and fire. One by one, the town began to empty. People packed up and left, terrified of what might crawl out of the woods next. Eventually, only Grandpa's family stayed, too stubborn to leave the home they'd built with their own hands. But one night, Grandpa saw him. He was just a boy, lying awake in bed when he heard the faint sound of wings. Not the flutter of birds or bats, but a deep, leathery whoosh that made his chest vibrate. Curious, he crept to the window and peered out. At first, he thought it was a tree, tall and black against the moonlight. But then it moved. It unfurled massive, tattered wings and turned to face the house. Its eyes, red and glowing like embers, locked onto Grandpa. I couldn't move, Grandpa whispered to me, decades later. I wasn't scared. I was just trapped. Those eyes held me, like they were pulling me out of myself. The creature stood there for what felt like hours before it finally lifted off the ground. The sound of its wings was deafening, shaking the entire house as it disappeared into the night. After that, Grandpa refused to go into the hollow. He said the lantern maker had made his greatest creation, a guardian for his woods. Years later, I forgot about Grandpa's stories. I grew up, moved to Chicago, and only visited him a handful of times before he passed. But recently, I had to return to West Virginia to settle his estate. The old house was in worse shape than I remembered, creaking with every step, the walls peeling like dead skin. The hollow hadn't changed, though. It was still there, dark and quiet as ever. Something about it drew me in, the way it always had when I was a kid. On my last night there, I decided to take a walk into the woods. I don't know why, nostalgia, maybe, or a foolish desire to prove to myself that Grandpa's stories were just that, stories. I brought a flashlight and a knife, feeling absurdly brave as I wandered deeper into the forest. The air was colder than it should have been, and the deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no crickets, just the sound of my own footsteps. I was about to turn back when I saw it. At first, it was just a glimmer of light, faint and golden, like a lantern swaying in the breeze. But then I saw the figure holding it. He looked just as Grandpa had described, tall, gaunt, with wild eyes that glinted like glass in the lantern's glow. He didn't seem to notice me, his attention fixed on the lantern. Then the shadows began to move. They poured out of the lantern like smoke, twisting and curling until they formed a shape. A pair of massive wings. Long, spindly limbs. And those eyes, burning red like coals. The creature stepped forward, its talons digging into the ground as it unfurled its wings. The lantern maker didn't move, didn't speak. He just smiled. I ran. I don't remember getting back to the house. I don't remember packing my bags or getting in the car. I only remember those eyes, watching me from the edge of the forest as I sped down the highway. Now, every time I close my eyes, I see them. I hear the sound of wings in the distance, growing closer each night. I think the lantern maker isn't done with me. And I can't shake this feeling that I need to return to the woods. In the weeks since I left Grandpa's house, I can't stop thinking about the hollow. I dream about it almost every night now. In the dreams, I'm always walking through the forest, but it's not how I remember it. The trees are impossibly tall, their branches tangling into a canopy so thick no light can pierce through. I feel something watching me, but I can never see it. Then, without fail, the lantern appears in the distance, its golden glow swaying gently like it's waiting for me. Sometimes, I see the lantern maker standing beneath it, his shadow stretching unnaturally long. Other times, I see the creature. Its wings fill the entire sky, blotting out the stars, and its glowing red eyes burn into my soul. Every time I wake up, I feel an overwhelming need to go back. It's not just a thought, it's a pull, a physical weight in my chest that grows heavier with each passing day. I've tried to distract myself, to ignore it, but it's always there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I don't know if it's curiosity or something worse, but I can't shake the feeling that the hollow isn't done with me. Or maybe I'm not done with it. Last night, the dream was different. I wasn't alone. I could hear whispers, low and indecipherable, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. And then, for the first time, the creature spoke to me. It didn't use words. It didn't need to. It was more like a thought pressed into my brain, heavy and undeniable. Come back. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like I'd run a marathon. The feeling hasn't gone away. I think I'm going to give in. Maybe it's madness, or maybe it's something I was always meant to do. But I have to know what's waiting for me in the hollow. I have to find out what the lantern maker created, and why it's calling me.